Hello, Elevate Youth community out there. I hope you're all having a good day on this rainy weekend. I am here to do our first instructional video where I'm going to teach you all the fundamentals you need to know about knots. And knots seem like something you probably think there's not too much to learn about, but there's a lot of complexity, and we're going to start with the very basics. So the first thing you can do is pause the video in a moment and go find yourself some rope. I have some big heavy rope like this that I'm going to use for the purpose of the video because it's a little easier to see on camera. But you can sometimes find stuff like this. This is core that you can get at most hardware stores. You might have some of this lying around your house. Worst case scenario, you can probably find some twine like this. This is useful for tying knots. The only thing to keep in mind with this is if you tie a knot in this and really pull it tight, you're probably never getting it untied again. So if you're practicing with something like this, just leave the knots a little loose, and you may have to cut it and start over if you do crank them tight. If you can't find anything like that around your house, even an old shoelace will work, and you can practice tying knots with that. So, here on the table in front of me, I have examples of two of the most basic things that we need to know about knots, and that is the kind of parts of the rope that we use to talk about. So first of all, the end that we're working with, we're going to call the working end. That's a pretty easy way to know that this is the side where all the stuff is happening. The other side that's going off to maybe the rest of the coil, if you have quite a bit, or just down on the floor, is the standing end. And that's the side that's going to be going to the thing you're trying to use the rope for. That's different from the side that you're working on. So here on the table, we have a bite and a loop. These look pretty similar. They are kind of taking the rope and making a circle. You'll notice that, though, that the loop crosses over itself, whereas the bite is the rope sort of doubled over on itself but not crossing. I like to think of, I remember this is called a bite because it kind of looks like a Pac-Man mouth that it could go along and chomp ghosts with. So we have a bite and a loop, and these are kind of the fundamental building blocks that all other knots are going to be based on. So let's start with a really easy knot for the sake of example. So if I gave you a piece of rope and said, tie a knot in this piece of rope, my guess is that you would all turn out with something that looks kind of like this. And this is an overhand knot, and this is the most simple knot. A lot of knots are going to use overhands in complicated ways with each other to make more complicated knots, but an overhand like this is one of the most fundamental types of knot that you can tie. So to do that again a little slower, I'm going to start with a loop like this. So I'm going to take the rope and make a circle that crosses back on itself, and then I'm going to take my working end and I'm going to stick it back through the hole such that when I pull it tight, I get a nice little sort of pretzel shape, and that's an overhand knot. Now, let's do the exact same knot, but instead of just using a loop and our working end, let's take a bite. So I'm going to take the rope and double it over on itself, and I'm going to leave myself maybe a 1.5 feet to work with, at least maybe 2 feet, and do that exact same knot, do an overhand, but now do it with this bite. And what I'm doing is I'm treating this doubled over rope and pretending in my brain like it's one rope that's all together. So if I were to take this bite, make a loop, and pass, the bite is now kind of my working end, pass the working end through and pull it tight, you can see that it's actually the same knot I had before. There's just two of them kind of stacked with each other. And this would be an overhand on a bite, which you can see makes this handy dandy little loop at the end. Maybe if you were going to then clip something to this, it'd be a useful way to create a loop where you didn't have one before. Another thing we can do with just these bites and loops and an overhand is make what's called a slip knot. Now a slip knot starts just as we did before, with a loop of rope crossing over itself. And then on this working end over here, on the other side of the loop, I'm going to make a bite. I'm going to keep the bite and the loop separate, but then I'm going to take this bite and stick it up through my loop, pull the loop tight over that end of the bite without pulling this end through. And I have something that kind of looks like the overhand on a bite, but you'll notice if you take this cut end, this working end, and pull it, the knot disappears. And that is because it slips back on itself. So let's show that again real fast. We have a knot here that looks kind of like a overhand on a bite, but when we pull it, pops and disappears.